Welcome to the deep dive. Today's topic, it's one of those that really gets under your skin. It's about the elusive hitman. You
Mhm.
hear the whispers, you see the movies, but it's a world shrouded in so much mystery.
It really is. And you've sent over some truly fascinating material for this deep dive. We've got psychological profiles, real-life cases, even some classic fiction to dig into.
Yeah, exactly. And our mission today is to go beyond just the sensationalism,
Mhm.
to really understand what makes a hitman so elusive. What are the skills? What's the mindset? What even drives someone to this kind of life?
Absolutely. And we're talking about people whose entire existence depends on staying hidden, on being ghosts. So how do we even begin to analyze that? Well, thankfully, the sources you've provided offer some really intriguing insights.
Okay, so let's start with the psychology. I was really struck by this concept of detachment in the studies you sent over. Like, can you imagine being able to just shut off your emotions to see killing as just another job?
It's chilling, isn't it? And it sort of challenges our assumptions. We tend to think of hitmen as psychopaths, but the research suggests this detachment is more of a learned skill, a coping mechanism to function in that world.
It's like extreme compartmentalization. You see it in other high-pressure jobs too, ER doctors, maybe even soldiers in combat. But of course, the stakes, they're very different.
Absolutely. The difference lies in the purpose, in the moral context of the actions, but that ability to emotionally detach, it's crucial in all those situations.
Another trait that came up was intelligence. Not just brute force, but a real emphasis on strategy and planning. Like they're playing chess, always thinking 10 steps ahead.
Right, and it's not just book smarts either. It's about reading people, understanding situations, predicting how things will unfold. To be truly elusive, you need to outsmart everyone, not just overpower them.
And then there's this idea of controlled aggression, not just flying off the handle, but using violence in a very precise, calculated way, almost like a surgeon, if that makes sense.
Exactly. It's about targeting the aggression, making it a tool rather than letting emotions take over. Because rage, it leads to mistakes. And in their line of work, mistakes are often fatal.
And speaking of fatal, the sources also mention paranoia and mistrust, which, let's be honest, in their world makes total sense. Who can you trust when everyone's a potential threat?
It's a lonely existence, isn't it? Always looking over your shoulder, never really letting anyone in. But that constant vigilance, it's the price of survival in that world.
It's interesting, though, because you see these same traits, the detachment, the intelligence, the paranoia, in elite military units, too.
That's what makes this comparison so fascinating. We see similar psychological adaptations in completely different contexts.
Yeah.
But the key difference, as the sources point out, is motivation. For a soldier, there's duty, a cause, a sense of serving something larger. But for a hitman, it's often personal gain, loyalty to a client, or even just plain survival.
So, listener, we've got to ask, does this picture of a hitman's mind surprise you? Did you imagine them as cold and calculating, or did you have a different image in mind? Think about where those ideas come from. Movies, books. It's worth considering how those narratives shape our perceptions.
It really is. Because now we're going to move from the mind to the methods. How does all this translate into action? And the sources you've provided, they paint a picture of incredible meticulousness.
Yeah, like the research and reconnaissance they do, weeks, sometimes months, just studying the target, learning their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. It's unsettling, really.
It's like a predator stalking its prey. Every detail matters. Every potential obstacle needs to be accounted for. Because in their world, failure is not an option.
And then there's the technology. You might think of this as an old school profession, but they're using encryption, surveillance, all the latest tech to stay ahead of the game.
They have to. It's an arms race, really. As technology advances, so do the methods of both the hunter and the hunted. It's a constant process of adaptation.
And then we get to the disguises, the alibis, creating these whole alternate identities, leaving false trails. It sounds like something out of a spy novel.
But it's about control, isn't it? Controlling the narrative, controlling the information. They need to be invisible before, during, and after the act.
And of course, there's the choice of weapons. The sources emphasize silent weapons, poison, garrotes, silenced firearms. It's all about discretion, about minimizing any trace.
Because noise attracts attention, and attention is the last thing they want. It's a stark contrast to the Hollywood image of shootouts and explosions. The reality is much quieter, much more calculated.
Speaking of reality, the sources bring up a chilling example. Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman. He was allegedly responsible for over 250 murders. And what's striking is how meticulous he was, how he constantly changed his methods to avoid detection.
It's a terrifying example of how effective these techniques can be in the real world. Kuklinski operated for decades, and it was his adaptability, his meticulousness that kept him in the shadows for so long.
So, listener, take a moment to think about this. The level of planning, the constant need to adapt, the sheer discipline involved, does it change how you view this world? It's not just about pulling a trigger, it's about maintaining this elaborate facade of normalcy.
It's a mental game as much as anything else. And that brings us to the next question. Why? What drives someone to this life? The sources explore several potential motivations, and they're not always what you'd expect.
The obvious one is money, right? The allure of big paydays, the promise of a life of luxury. But is it really just about greed?
Well, for some it might be a means to an end, a way out of poverty, a chance to secure a future. But even then, it's a twisted way of looking at things, putting a price on human life like that.
And then there's the power aspect. The idea that you have the ultimate control, the power over life and death, that can be a powerful draw for some personalities.
Especially for those who feel powerless in other areas of their lives. It's a dangerous and distorted sense of control, but it's a motivation nonetheless.
The sources also talk about personal vendettas, revenge killings driven by hate and the need for retribution. But they also point out that those emotions can be a liability.
Because revenge, it's not rational. It can cloud your judgment, lead to recklessness. And in this world, staying detached, staying unemotional, that's crucial.
And then you have loyalty, especially in organized crime where obedience is everything. The hitman becomes a tool of the organization, carrying out orders without question.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? To have your morality, your very humanity, subsumed by the needs of the group. But in that context, it's about survival. Disobedience can be even more dangerous than obedience.
And it's interesting how the sources also touch on the reluctant hitman archetype. You see it a lot in fiction. Characters like John Wick, people forced into this life or trying to escape it.
It adds a layer of moral complexity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It allows us to explore the human cost of this world, the idea that even those who commit terrible acts might still have a shred of humanity left.
So, listener, we're curious. Which of these motivations resonates most with you? The money, the power, the revenge, the loyalty? Or maybe that idea of the reluctant killer trapped in a world they can't escape. It's a complex and unsettling question, but it's worth pondering.
It really is. And it leads us to another important point. How does all of this, the reality of the hitman's world, compare to the way they're portrayed in popular culture?
Because, let's be honest, Hollywood loves to glamorize this figure, but the sources paint a very different picture. One of constant fear, isolation, and a very real threat of violence.
It's not all fancy suits and cocktails. The reality is much grittier, much more psychologically demanding, always looking over your shoulder, never truly feeling safe. It takes a toll.
And the movies often show them with unlimited resources, the latest gadgets like they're James Bond or something. But in reality, there are budgets, logistical limitations. It's not always so slick and seamless.
Right, improvisation is key. And sometimes you have to make do with what you have. It's about efficiency, not extravagance.
And then there's the whole moral aspect. In fiction, you often see hitmen struggling with their actions, questioning their choices. But in reality, the sources suggest it's more about survival. Morality takes a back seat when you're constantly fighting to stay alive and undetected.
It's a bleak outlook, but it makes sense. When your existence is so precarious, introspection can be a luxury you can't afford.
But despite all this, we remain fascinated by this figure. The hitman, the assassin, they keep popping up in movies, books, TV shows. Why do you think that is? What is it about this archetype that captures our imagination?
Well, there's the element of danger, the thrill of the unknown. Maybe it's the idea of someone operating outside the rules, living by their own code. And let's be honest, there's a certain mystique to the skill set, to the precision and planning involved.
It's like a dark reflection of ourselves in a way. We see the darkness, the violence, but also the intelligence, the resourcefulness. It's a complex and contradictory image.
It really is. And it raises some fascinating questions about our own relationship with power, with morality, with the very idea of taking a human life.
So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought. We've talked about the psychology, the methods, the motivations of the elusive hitman. But in a world where technology is constantly evolving, where surveillance is becoming more and more sophisticated, can this archetype even survive?
Will the traditional hitman, the master of shadows, be forced to adapt, or will they become obsolete? Will AI and facial recognition make their skills irrelevant? Or will there always be a place for human ingenuity, for the ability to slip through the cracks, to exploit the weaknesses in any system?
It's a question that goes beyond just this one profession. It's about the tension between technology and human nature, between the digital and the physical. And the answer, well, that remains to be seen. But it's certainly something to think about, isn't it?
It is, and it's a testament to the enduring power of this archetype, this figure, who embodies both our fears and our fascinations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.